Now, let's talk about the role of private capital for development. I would like to welcome Marie Nielsen, partner at Antler, Africa. She is responsible for managing venture capital funds across the continent and oversees a significant investment portfolio. Marie Nielsen is also known as the founder of Penda Paper, a paper recycling company in Ethiopia. Please welcome Marie Nielsen.
Did you know that only 1% of global private capital was actually invested in Africa last year? A shockingly low number if you think about countries like Singapore, with only 4 million people attracting the same amount of capital, while Africa is an entire continent with 1.3 billion people. Yet to say, despite receiving a very small number of financing, Africa has been able to, in the last decade, to create 9 unicorns. Or companies that have been valued to be worth more than $1 billion. Many of them being in the financial service industry, making services available for the unbanked, or building infrastructure that the banks maybe are not willing to build. So although a very thriving or promising journey of startups creating tremendous impact for the nations and countries as a whole, there's a looming problem. At this point in time, Africa is the home to 22% of the global youth population, and unemployment is one of the biggest challenges the country is facing. If you think about it, in 2030, Africa is expected to be the home to more than 40% of the global youth population. Just imagine, if we can't have enough jobs for people today, how is that going to look in just a couple of years to come? Governments are trying their best to create jobs. I remember when I lived in Ethiopia, I was building, as was mentioned, a company called Penda, which is a paper recycling company. We were working very closely with the government of Ethiopia to create jobs. And I remember sitting in the office of an agency that's called the Micro Enterprise Agency, and speaking to the leader of the agency called Konjit, who was a fantastic lady. And she had this little certificate in her office, and I'll still remember it, which was a certificate for having created 1 million jobs. 1 million jobs in anything from waste management as part of a government job, or working with NGOs and other actors to train people to get into jobs and income opportunities. But then I thought to myself, 1 million jobs, that's amazing. How many people have been able to facilitate that? But if we need 100+ millions of jobs, where is that going to come from? And personally, I believe the key to that is private sector. Africa needs to grow its private sector. The continent is booming, but to be able to solve some of the challenges ahead, it needs to boom much faster. Also, in my experience, Africa does not lack talent. Urban Africa is full of aspiring talent that wants to build companies. It does also not lack ideas. But the problem, in my opinion, are 2 missing essential components. Number 1, capital, to be willing to fund those startups from the very early days of building a company, as well as a conducive ecosystem where it's okay and possible to take risk. As a partner at Antler, I've been part of building Antler's presence in Africa. We're a global investor, and we run programs like an incubator where young entrepreneurs can come in and build the companies that they think can transform the environments they live in. We have funds now across 30 countries around the world. And we have invested and support more than 1,400 portfolio companies or startups across the world. But what's the most interesting about this is we've now been investing in Africa since 2019. We made 25 investments with our first investment fund, which was a $14 million fund. And we're not the least performing fund. I think if you compare the Africa fund relative to all the other funds in the world, we're actually among the top 5 best performing funds. I don't think anyone really thought that was possible when we started, but I think but I think it's telling a story of Africa is soon, in my opinion, getting to a point where it's not only going to attract development-focused capital that wants to make a positive impact, but it's reaching a stage where it can potentially compete and attract commercial capital. And just imagine what that could take the continent to in terms of opportunities growth and building aspiring companies. So what Antler does in this context is we look for smart people. And sometimes we have to convince people to leave a stable job and take the risk of going entrepreneurship. And the way we do that is by creating a conducive environment. We have an innovation hub in Nairobi where people come, meet the co-founders, come up with ideas, get coaching, and then eventually build the company that they want to build with funding from Antler. And what happens is large companies, if successful, tend to then transform the societies we live in. Some examples of companies we built include iFluence. It's an influencer marketing platform using AI to identify micro and nano influencers that can have a very credible voice in smaller communities. Actually, you might think this sounds commercial, but one of their biggest customers are actually NGOs. NGOs looking to communicate messages to rural, hard-to-reach communities in new and different ways. COVID, for example, was an interesting period where they were helping with campaigns for hand washing and other things like that. Another example is Mawasi. Mawasi is trying to solve actually a European problem. Fast fashion, creating tremendous problems for the African continent, being the recipient of a lot of clothes that are being left over and dumped. So Mawasi is working with European retailers to basically create a much better value chain for how to sustainably think about the end of lifetime for apparel. And a final company which I'm super excited about is Kafresh. Kafresh has invented a spray, 100% plant-based, that can extend the shelf life of agricultural produce. Just think about it. Why does a banana take longer to spoil than an apple if you just leave them on the table in front of you? And it has to do with the oils that protect the banana. So if you take the oils of an apple and spray it onto the banana, suddenly the banana can last 2 or 3 weeks longer in your house. A very interesting company. And I don't think many people understand that this kind of innovation is coming out of markets we think of as far back in the days. This can solve tremendous world food security problems. Even in your house, I'm sure you have a lot of things that are just lying there to be spoiled. So Africa is leapfrogging, I think, in so many ways. It being in renewable energy, it being in mobile money, using new technology like blockchain, et cetera, et cetera. It's really happening, and it's happening right now. But private capital cannot solve this alone. Although private capital can be a catalytic component to drive innovation and, I guess, development to the next level, it needs people to collaborate. It needs development finance institutions to maybe de-risk in some cases. It requires NGOs and other partners to make sure that these products and innovations that are coming out, they truly get reach. And it requires, of course, the private sector as well. I think Antler is a good example of this. I don't think Antler would have launched in Nairobi 5 years ago if it wasn't for the collaboration we had with Norad, de-risking the ability to build what we build in Kenya over, for example, entering New York or London or some of these bigger, easier places to launch an Antler location. We were lucky as well to have Norfund on board, which came into our fund, and we've been working with many private family offices, I think Lærdal as well, which is in the audience somewhere, to really make this happen. So I think, as Bård Vegar mentioned, you really need the whole ecosystem to function together to be able to mobilize private capital, to de-risk and make things happen that probably otherwise wouldn't have happened. So to bring this back again to where I started, if Africa to date has proven that with 1% of global capital, it can accomplish a lot of tremendous things. Momentum is there. Private sector is starting to see the continent as a serious place to invest. And it's really about to reach, for me, an inflection point where development can have a different narrative than it used to have in the past. So if 1% of capital has been able to prove this, just imagine if we were able together to make that become 5%. Thank you so much.